Dutch people under 25 completely identify, regardless of their ethnic background, identify with these Cape Verdean boys singing in Surinamese, coming from the streets of Rotterdam, all black, making black music in a black diaspora style. That says something about what the identity is of Holland today. That's what Holland is today.
We invited Maarten van Hinte. He's a writer, teacher, hip-hop artist, and most of all, the creative brain behind the urban production house Right About Now.
So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a great honor. This is a quote from Paul Gilroy. So striving to be both European and black requires some specific forms of double consciousness. However, where racist, nationalist, or ethnically absolutist discourses orchestrate political relationships so that these identities appear to be mutually exclusive, occupying the space between them or trying to demonstrate their continuity has been viewed as a provocative and even oppositional act of political insubordination. So the space between these identities, European identity and a black identity, that's what I'm going to talk about in the Dutch context. So what are we talking about? And I don't want to be long, so I'm going to be quick and short, and probably sometimes too short. This is sort of Dutch identity, the way it perceives itself in a way. Clothing, that's an image from a movie, Soldaat van Oranje. That's about the war, resistance to oppression. And that's Johan Cruyff playing against Argentina. Essentially, a kind of Dutch identity summarized in a way, the European Dutch identity. The black identity in Holland sort of falls together with Suriname. That's a country in Latin America, for those who don't know, a former colony of the Dutch. Why do I say Suriname? Because in fact, in Dutch, the word Surinamer, meaning a Surinamese person, is actually used as a synonym for a black person, even though we have people from all kinds of... Surinamer means a black person. And this is sort of the context, the colonial context in which that identity is sort of forged. So it's European. Now, this is another image of very much Dutch identity. I think nobody will dispute the fact this is really Holland at its... this is Holland. It's a cup of coffee and a cookie. A kopje koffie en een koekje. Which you give to people when you invite them in your house, when everybody stops in work framework, 11 o'clock, we have a kopje koffie with the koekje. So this is quintessentially Dutch and has been for hundreds of years. And the interesting thing about this is that nothing about this picture is Dutch. Absolutely nothing. The cup of coffee, yeah, it's imitation Chinese porcelain, which we call Delft Blue, but it's Chinese. So the coffee and the sugar in the coffee are two products which could only be produced with slave labor in the past and which have become part of the Dutch identity because the Dutch were able to actually exploit slaves and make that sugar and make that coffee and make the money that they could get from selling it worldwide. And the cookie, speculaas, like almost all Dutch traditional pastries for occasions, is chock full of spices which could only be produced in a colonial system of exploitation and slavery. So this quintessentially Dutch picture is not Dutch, but it says a lot about Holland. And it says also a lot about, I guess, the Atlantic. And how the Atlantic trade actually defined what Holland is today. Now I'm going to make a big jump. I don't have a lot of time. So now I'm in the 30s. So I talked about European and black identity, element of black identity. So I said Suriname. This is a poster from the 30s in the Netherlands. It's a poster by the Musicians Union. Don't become a musician. That profession was almost extinct for Dutch people, and it represents a musician who's being threatened by a gramophone and by a black musician, essentially by what jazz music was bringing to the Netherlands in the years 20s and 30s. So we're talking about music and how music sort of reflects a discourse about identity. I think this is a very clear poster in terms of how it was perceived, and also black identity was perceived in the Netherlands in terms of music in the 30s. Another quote from Gilroy, which you used in the work. The Negro is no longer just America's metaphor, but rather a central symbol in the psychological, cultural, and political systems of the West as a whole. The image of the Negro and the idea of race, which it helps to found, are living components of a Western sensibility that extends beyond national boundaries, linking America to Europe and its empires. So we just saw the link between Holland and its empires. The transmutation of the African into the Negro is shown to be central to Western civilization, especially to the primitive, irrational, and mystical elements in European culture. So we just saw in the previous picture the Negro, the African becoming the Negro, becoming a threat to Dutch identity. So taking the cue from this quote, this is a picture of a Dutch family listening to the radio. I show this picture because radio is, of course, a vehicle for transmitting music, and radio in Holland has a particular structure. But actually, up until the 80s, it was very much state-controlled, and people were allocated, organizations were permitted to use the radio for music. So you had not so much the state controlling the content, but it did control who had access, and it passed the access to different denominations. So you had a Protestant radio, a Catholic radio, you had a secular radio, you had these different... So this thinking about the radio and the way it sort of basically curated the music that was made available to the entire country, because there was no commercial radio, influenced the impact of African diaspora culture and music in the Netherlands to a great extent. I'm not going to go into that in more detail because I don't have time, but I am moving on to the 70s, when actually after the Second World War, migration started happening from the different former colonies of Holland. These are pictures from the 70s when a big wave of Surinamese migration came to the Netherlands because Suriname gained its independence in 1975. So you had these migrants and their children, not just Surinamese, of course, because you also had North African migrants. You had migrants from other Dutch colonies and former Dutch colonies, from Indonesia, from the Moluccans. You had migrants from the different islands in the Caribbean. But the basic image of the black migrant is the Surinamese migrant. And they arrived in a country in which everything was curated and where their music was heard to a certain extent on pop radio stations. You had black music, of course. And of course, the music already had been influencing Dutch culture, particularly jazz music, completely transformed Dutch literature in the 50s. But it was still elsewhere and not there. So they did not see their own representation in music and in culture. This is a picture from the 1980s. So it's essentially those children growing up. The 1980s saw the proliferation of pirate radio stations, and particularly in the big cities, so in Amsterdam and in Rotterdam. And these radio stations played almost exclusively African-American music, and particularly club music. So I guess the music, disco after disco was declared dead. So we're talking about music made in the early 80s. And it all came through import record shops. When you would walk in town, when you would go to the shops, all the shops would be pumping this music from these illegal radio stations, which were being cracked down regularly. So this music came in, and it sort of mainlined into the street culture of black youth in Amsterdam, in Rotterdam, in these big cities. What also came in with this music was hip-hop. And now hip-hop, of course, you had hits like Rapper's Delight, and so you had a couple of hits which would come in the mainstream of popular music. But something else was happening in these radio stations. And so between these dance tracks and club tracks, you would hear tracks like this one. This is one of the early hip-hop tracks, Dougie Fresh and Slick Rick. The show, it's beatboxing, it's very much raw street hip-hop, and this would come in between lush disco tracks in this radio station. And this is how hip-hop came to the black community in the Netherlands. these youths were finding an identity which was outside of the Dutch identity, but also outside of the Surinamese identity of their parents. This American street music was what they identified with in terms of finding their own identities. End of the 80s, the big event in terms of identity and in terms of European and black identities being separated was actually football. This is the Dutch team that won the European Cup at the end of the 80s. And this team had several Surinamese players. All of them, of course, were immediately Dutch. So up until that point, black was Surinamese, even if it came from another country. And around that point, it shifted, and black could also be Dutch because they won the European Cup for Holland. The 90s were the years when that kind of thinking sort of became more spread about. People talked about a multicultural society. End of the 90s came the pushback. So these are two politicians. He's slightly more recent, but I'm showing them together anyway. Explicitly racist platforms. Typically, though, they were part of the general discourse. So in the early 90s, talk about the failure of multicultural society, talk about different concepts, and also racist concepts were things which were talked about outside of politics. The end of the 90s in Holland meant it became part of the political discourse. It's the mainstream political discourse, the general political discourse. So that was a very, very strong pushback to the idea that Dutch identity could be something else than the European identity, could be something else entirely. This is around the knots, right? 2000, 2001, 2000. The most popular music in this period in time in Holland was Frans Bauer. Now, I know it's funny, but at the same time, what we have to realize is that Frans Bauer, at that time, and with the album that he put out, broke every single record for music in the Netherlands, right? So he demolished the Beatles' records for selling records. He demolished Michael Jackson's record for selling records. He was by far the best-selling artist in the Netherlands ever. And he stayed that for close to 13 years, which is a long time. His big hit was this song. Frans Bauer, again, by far the biggest selling artist in Dutch music recording industry. Demolished all the records until 2016. In 2016, another artist, actually a group of artists, completely crushed his record and blew it completely out of the water. Broederliefde. Broederliefde. Now, this is a very exotic video clip, but all of these boys were born in Rotterdam, grew up in Rotterdam. They actually flew out, some of them for the first time, out of Holland to make this clip. A couple of interesting things. The language in which they write their songs is Dutch street language, actually based on Surinamese, right? So it's based on Surinamese, Dutch street language, which is based on Surinamese, both in grammar and in use of particular words. All the more interesting that they are not Surinamese. They're actually Cape Verdean, because there's a Cape Verdean minority living in Rotterdam due to the harbor. So nothing about what they make is typical or fits typically into any kind of exact category. So now another quote from Gilroy. Examining, which is of course in Tony's video. Examining the place of music in the Black Atlantic world means surveying the self-understanding articulated by the musicians who have made it, the symbolic use to which their music is put by other black artists and writers, and the social relations which have produced and reproduced the unique expressive culture in which music comprises a central and even foundational element. So, as I said, their record still stands, right? They are by far the best-selling artists in the Dutch recording industry. There's a reason why they blew Frans Bauer out of the water. Not just because they sold very well, but also because they started shifting the way they counted record sales, and including the internet. A self-understanding articulated by the musicians who have made it. I'm going to show you another clip by the same group. It's a fact, that's what they're singing. It's a fact. Our success is a fact. So, broederliefde. What you have to understand in understanding what their success means, it means that Dutch people under 25 completely identify, regardless of their ethnic background, identify with these Cape Verdean boys singing in Surinamese, coming from the streets of Rotterdam, all black, making black music in a black diaspora style. That says something about what the identity is of Holland today. That's what Holland is today. We identify with this. And we, I mean, as a Dutch people. And if it's not us, but it's the people under 25, have no problem. And in fact, this is saying something about hip-hop, which is often categorized as a marginal current. It's actually now, right now, really the Dutch mainstream. Of these top 10 artists, 7 of them are hip-hop artists. Only 1 is an American. The other 6 are all Dutch, rhyming in Dutch, rapping in Dutch, or rhyming in street Dutch, which is Surinamese elements. This is the mainstream in Holland today. Last thought, I again go back to the quote of Paul Gilroy: the transmutation of the African into the Negro is shown to be central to Western civilization, especially to the primitive, irrational, and mystical elements of European culture. Now, what's interesting is that the type of music which is now being made, so hip-hop in Holland started, as I said, the music came in the early 80s. They started making Dutch hip-hop with English lyrics in the 80s, 90s. Dutch lyrics came early 2000. Now, and you heard it in Broederliefde's rhythm, it's not just the lyrics. The rhythms are not American hip-hop rhythms anymore. They're African and Caribbean. And if you look now at what is popular in youth culture, the first picture is I'm a piano artist, which is dance music, a type of house music from South Africa. Second picture are afrobeat artists. If you know people 15, 16 years old now, they're all dancing to this music, listening to these lyrics, which are sung in languages that they don't understand, which was inconceivable 20 years ago, in African languages. So, in a way, musically, we're looking back towards, actually, the African identity of the music. It's going to be interesting to see what that means in terms of identity and in terms of what the Black Atlantic means for our cultural future as a country. Okay, that's my talk.
If you look at your video, Micro House, it's also like relating something to discussions about cultural appropriation, about appropriation music. Could you elaborate a bit on what you try to say in that work about? Because it really reminded me of discussions about cultural appropriation, but it seemed as if you add something or that you reframe something that also has to do with the story of Maarten.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I was interested in is the debate around, quote unquote, who originated techno, what context in which, it can circulate and or should circulate in. And it's almost like, well, you could think about it in a kind of strict identitarian sense. But when you do that, you also run the risk of being reductive in certain ways about the conditions of possibility, not only for people on the ground making the music and receiving it, but also for its futures. And maybe I'm making a polemic that, as much as we might want to control those flows and those uses, it's one thing to say that something is appropriated. It's another thing maybe to try to think in complex ways about the so-called origins of the form that you're talking about. I don't think it's just a cliche that, techno is, George Clinton and Kraftwerk meeting in an elevator. Now, if you don't want to live in a world where that is, a kind of condition of possibility, or if you only want to stick to a specific historical narrative about the origin of a particular type of music, and that only, it can only be made by certain people in certain places. It seems that, there's a lot of history that would contradict that, including the history of like techno itself. It's like it's not simple, or a simple origin, nor is it, an origin that one could say is one culture or one sexuality. There's always been multiple, would be my argument, and that we were probably going to see more, complex hybridities, including more accusations around the question of cultural appropriation. But I don't know, some of them can be both positive and exceed any, knowledge that one would have in a kind of historical or cultural sense. In a certain way, my argument might be that's part of the point. It's almost like people who are not expected to have access to certain material and certain technologies do get access to it and do things that perhaps were not part of the intentionality of their, initial construction. And that's part of the beauty of it, as opposed to a limitation. But
yeah, I agree. I think, in fact, even the qualification of, that this belongs to this group is actually a very European way of thinking. Because if you look at the history of the music in the African diaspora, it's all about appropriating. Now, of course, now I'm ignoring the power dynamics of
and
oppressor
the financial interest behind it.
That's because I think that's a real discussion about appropriation. But literally the way music travels and the way, particularly in the culture of the African diaspora, it's really about finding what you have and making it your own. So it's always been like that. And that could be electronic, but it could also be, people don't always realize, for example, that dancehall music from reggae, which is sort of the base for reggaeton, that music, people say, it's just reggae. It's not. Roots reggae is completely different. It's not the same source. In fact, the dancehall source is the quadrille, which was a dance form that the French peasants did in kind of a minuet-type form. That's where, this is something I saw Robbie Shakespeare and Sly Dunbar explain in a documentary. It comes from quadrille because they were that was the party music in the countryside in Jamaica. I think the force of African diaspora culture is the fact that it's been able to move so quickly that it's essentially determined the entire landscape of popular music worldwide, period.
Almost as though if there were no black diaspora practices, what kind of popular music would you have? It's not a question of like trying to, synthesize and limit. It's more sort of like what possibilities haven't been inculcated by those practices or their derivatives.
Yeah.
And, you could make the argument that kind of, as you were saying, about methodology of using, kind of received materials. You could say that anyone who takes those approaches has some interest and potential claim, to those practices. It's not like they weren't originally appropriated in a certain sense for particular, from particular positions. So this idea that it can never, cultural appropriation can never happen or should never happen. It's sort of like, how would that, remedy the maybe strange facts that we find on the ground today? It's, maybe it would be better to acknowledge that, different people appropriate for different reasons and in different positions with different power results and financial gain as part of that equation. I mean, I especially kind of find interesting the title of the single, Hard Work Pays Off, which is kind of like, well, yes, but maybe not, it's...
So I have one question related to this. Because you're an American artist, but you also exhibit a lot in Europe. And I was thinking, how do you think about like your own work traveling in different contexts? Because Maarten is showing a lot like how this specific video really relates to European discussion, to Dutch discussion. But you also sometimes get a critique like, should we always invite American artists or American culture in a European context? Because that are two different things. I'm just curious how you think about your own work in these different contexts and how you relate to that, actually.
I mean, I think it has been interesting to me that the reception of my work in Europe, being mostly about America, mostly in English, has been of a different pitch than in the United States, where I'm from. I think on some level it might be because maybe my interests and approaches may be more legible in a place that is not the United States, whereas I think the desires and expectations of my compatriots may be relatively different, or maybe they have a different idea about what American art can and should be. You know, the reception of the work, it's like I can't control it. I used to think that one could, you know, in a kind of old school way. I appear with the work and talk about it and contextualize it. But more often than not, the work kind of gets circulated in contexts that I have no direct control over, and I acknowledge that. And I think that kind of sometimes leads to very interesting, you know, juxtapositions and confrontations, and I'm happy for those. But yeah, why, you know, it's sort of taken so long for my work to be recognized, you know, in the place that I, you know, come from, and has received a different kind of reception here. I mean, you'd probably be as well positioned to try to answer that question as I would. And I hope that, you know, it does promote an ability to see relations and contradictions in places that, you know, I'm not from, not part of that, you know, cultural history in a direct way, but, you know, kind of a kind of framework and a kind of pattern. Yeah.
I think it's like there's a parallel like with house music. It's interesting that it started in Chicago as a local phenomenon, and that these records were selling in Europe, and these artists had no idea because they weren't just. And now, of course, people like Beyoncé and Drake are all making house records, sampling these classic house tracks, which were ignored by the pop world in the States, which were specifically for a subculture, which are now coming in on the main stage, like 30 years after they were actually came about, and they're coming through, passing all over the world, and then coming back to the States. So it's also, some conversations are difficult in that framework, I think, firstly when they deal with African American culture.
Yeah. Give a very warm applause.